isn't that working?
Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to the SACM working group meeting. We have a Jabber scribe and we have minute takers, and we are about to pass out blue sheets.
We should do that.
We should do that. And while Adam is doing that, this is the IETF note well. You will have seen this prior to registering for the meeting and many times since. If you have any questions, be sure to ask. I think the details are quite correct. Administrative stuff we've already taken care of, huh?
Yeah, we're already done.
We did note takers and scribe, right? Yep. And this is the agenda for the week, or the agenda for today, actually. We do have a second meeting on Friday. And with that, I think we're ready to get started.
We will do status.
Yeah, we could do status. Oh, that's what I meant by get started.
Forgot the status slide.
You forgot.
Let's talk about it.
It is Monday morning.
It is Monday morning, sorry. So forgot to put the status slide up there. Information model draft was updated. Terminology draft was updated. I think the SWID M&A draft was updated too, right, Charles? Not before this?
Not before this was updated prior.
Okay. Requirements draft is not yet submitted for IESG, right?
So I didn't see any open issues.
Good morning.
Good morning. Okay. Is this even on?
I think it's on.
Yeah. Is it on? Okay. So Nancy Cam Winget, one of the editors for the requirements draft. I was looking at the GitHub for open issues and didn't see any.
There are no, ooh, wow, that's loud. There are no open issues. It's ready to be submitted. We had a quick question on whether we wanted to ask for a privacy review prior to submitting it or not. Adam and I discussed that this morning and decided we didn't want to, we were just going to go ahead and submit it prior and ask for the privacy review during that phase. So,
Okay, good.
all right.
So no actions for me.
There's no actions for you. There's just actions for us. Oh, that thing is, maybe that's why
I'll
they
be
have-
bringing up, I guess, 2 small issues later today for requirements.
On the list, yeah. Yeah, okay.
He's going to bring
One
it.
more. He's going to bring it up here.
Okay. Well, we don't have it on the agenda, so we might as well talk about it now. You were done with status, right?
No, there's one more.
Okay.
Also, we haven't yet put the vulnerability draft into working group last call. That'll probably happen soon. That's it.
Okay, so that was the end of the working group status overview. Any questions on that? Okay. We don't actually have the requirements draft on the agenda because I didn't realize there was any issues. So if you have, if you have issues, can you please bring them up now?
I was going to talk about them at the end of the information model session.
Oh, okay. So we'll come back to them at that
Yeah.
point then.
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you. With that, then let's go on to the SWID work. The pink box is lovely. It's located back here.
Good morning.
Yeah.
What? Who?
This is the right one.
Yeah. So I'm Charles Schmidt. Just wanted to talk about SWID M&A. My real goal for today is we've had a few conversations in the mailing list about the data model, and I'd really like to pin them down. I'd hope to have some consensus before we got here. We didn't really seem to get that on the list, so hopefully we can do that. Yeah, so next slide, please. Data model. Also wanted to talk a little bit about architectural role. This piggybacks off of some comments that Hank raised at the last virtual interim. I just want to see if we can pin that down so that there's not any confusion. Again, we talked about it a little on the mailing list, but nothing that sounded anything like consensus seemed to arise. And of course, if anyone has any additional questions, please feel free to raise this. I'm not sure that I've got 60 minutes of stuff, so yeah, please bring it up. Next slide, please. So this stems from some of the conversations on the list. Again, when I tried to pin down a lot of data models, there was a lot of really good discussions, but as I sort of looked into the suggested standards and specifications that people were raising, there were a lot of people who looked like they were proposing unique identifier formats rather than descriptive structures for software information. And I wanted to try to pin down exactly what we are all expecting this specification to do. So as a reminder, the 30-second background, SWID message and attributes, it's based on an existing trusted network communication, trusted computing group specification. It was written originally as a way to transport the ISO SWID specification records from the endpoint to the server, or identifiers associated with those tags themselves. So want to emphasize that the current SWID specification includes both the ability to transport the structured records, these are SWID tags, and also it has the ability to report using unique identifiers, but those unique identifiers are not intended to be unique identifiers of a piece of software. The unique identifiers uniquely identify a SWID tag document. Not exactly the same thing. Closely related, but not exactly the same thing. So in any case, we're opening up where there's been a lot of questions about whether we should really be binding so strongly to the ISO SWID specification. Those are very legitimate questions. We want to look at that. But when I was asking for alternative structures, alternative descriptive structures, there were a lot of, more than half of the conversation seemed to revolve around, well, you could use this unique identifier format or this unique identifier format. So the question to the group, and I realized that this is the first session on the first day, but I would like to get some answers on this, is what is it? How are we expecting to report our software inventories? Are people interested in having endpoints report a descriptive piece of information? Descriptive information could include name of the software, version of the software, publisher of the software, other things like that. Or are people expecting that the endpoint report a unique identifier, not necessarily descriptive in any way, something like a GUID or some other managed identifier set that someone could resolve to descriptive information, but that the endpoint would only be reporting that unique identifier. And I've got some thoughts on that, but before I clutter the room with my own personal opinions on that, I wanted to see if anyone has some suggestions on that. Again, right now, SWID message and attributes has message flows to support both a descriptive reporting of software and a reporting by a concise reporting using unique identifiers, although those unique identifiers are associated with tags, not unique identifiers of software. So at that point, what are people's thoughts on this? Do people have strong opinions one way or another? Should we use unique identifiers? Should we use descriptors? Should we use both? Anyone? Thank you, Hank.
Hi, this is Hank.
What's your last name, then?
My last name is Birkholz. And I will relay some opinions, I think, because yesterday I was talking with a lot of authors, actually, of specifications and standards regarding device identification and such, and also the construction of certificates and maybe the next generation of certificates. And all they agree upon one thing, that it is immaterial to the problem if the data is only referenced or directly available on the point in question. So in this case, it should be, in the end, immaterial to the problem if this is only a reference or if this is a complete description, the metadata and the details. I think what is important for solution is that you get a better answer than this, because there might be some scalability issues or just some production issues if you only work with references. This could explode at some point. On the other hand, carrying all the baggage around with you is also, again, a bottleneck. So I think that is why, and there were 3 independent individuals that were basically agreeing on it should not be a question, it should be easy for you to switch between both, even mix them. And this should not bite you at the foot sometime later on.
So the catch, I would say, in that is that it should be immaterial, provided that those unique identifiers can always be resolved to descriptive information. Would that be a suitable caveat there?
Yes, it depends on the use. If you're just, no. In theory, yes, this use case specific, of course. If you are just creating an inventory, you do not have to resolve them. It's good enough for you to have just the identifiers. And then when you have a problem, you have to resolve it. So this is basically not at every step in the workflow you need to have them resolved, necessarily. Especially when collecting them. It might be a problem to also resolve them all the time, because collection could be a very big task if you scale it through a lot of target endpoints, I guess.
So again, to clarify, it's not a problem. It's not an issue during collection, provided that you resolve the reality to that unique identifier in a universally standard way. Yeah.
Later, yes. While collection, it doesn't matter, I guess. This is only my personal opinion. This is maybe not the general thing. But I have to resolve it at some point, especially in the back end, when they traverse the domain. But not especially at the collection step, which is basically tackled by the NIA solution, I think. Is this okay answer? Or
when I say resolving, I'm talking, I guess, reverse resolution, where you are taking ground truth, that the endpoint needs to be reporting the exact same unique identifier to represent whatever ground truth it's trying to report. So the presence of a particular version of a particular piece of software has to always be the same identifier. It doesn't need to be descriptive when it gets transported, but you have to always make sure that that endpoint is using the same unique identifier every time, and the same unique identifier that every other endpoint is using in order to report.
This is an interesting question. I thought we were talking about payload SWIDs and not about evidence SWIDs. It seems to me that you are talking about evidence here right now, which is generated on the endpoint and not supplied by the vendor. So what kind of SWIDs are we talking about at the moment?
Could you elaborate between what you mean by payload SWIDs and evidence
There
SWIDs?
are resource collections in a SWID, which can, but mainly it can be including a payload, which is basically provided by the vendor. So they are installed with the software, and then there's the SWID generated on the target endpoint itself, which would then be an evidence resource collection, which is different from the payload SWID and would have therefore a different identifier. So a locally generated SWID, I think, can never have the same identifier if it comes from two different endpoints, if it's containing evidence. Am I right? I think so.
That is a concern. My understanding is that regardless of whether we are collecting evidence that has been placed by a vendor, so what
that's payload.
That
evidence
would be
is never
payload,
supposed to be
right.
placed. Yeah.
And or we are collecting evidence that is, or we are collecting, well, evidence, as you said, that this is something that is generated on the endpoint to indicate a load. My understanding is that the critical point of this is not so much who published, who created this information, but that we are representing the endpoint's software inventory, that we only report a SWID tag if and only if there is a piece of software on the endpoint whose presence we are trying to report. In other words, the goal of SWID message and attributes is to try to send from the endpoint to the server a list of installed applications.
Again, a list of installed applications can be associated with vendor-supplied SWIDs, which can be signed and then are basically immutable. You can detect the corruption, and you have the local generated ones, and you have to. I still don't understand which one you're trying to use at this point. So,
both.
Yeah, and both will not suit your task. I think evidence tags will always be different. If you find a specific software on an endpoint, how does it create an identifier? You cannot. This identifier is created on the target endpoint, I think, and I'm not sure if this has the same quality if the identifier is created by the vendor. Maybe it does. Maybe Dave has an opinion on this, or maybe John. I don't know.
Jim, are you in a new topic or?
I don't know.
Okay.
I have a slight problem with the statement that the global identifier has to be resolvable, because I don't know what that means for a lot of global identifiers. I think you have to be able to report it. I think it needs to be globally unique, but I think you can and you want to be able to collect identifiers you cannot resolve and tell someone that you have done so.
Okay.
Hello, John Strassner. In general, I agree with what Hank was saying. I think that we need two concepts. First, when you're talking about reporting descriptive or recommended, i.e. prescriptive information, there's no standard format to do that. So that means that you need metadata, because if something is not an innate characteristic of an object, well, then it shouldn't be a class attribute, right? It's actually data that describes that data, hence the use of metadata. Second, in SUPA, we've come up with we're using SEMVer, www.semver.org. It's a fairly standardized way of versioning information. And we have an example that shows how to attach metadata to any object. And that, I think, would start to solve the payload versus evidence, because now I'm not looking for the foobar attribute. I can rather query for all of the descriptive information, I would call it capabilities that you have, and then you can gather those up and exchange them. That also implies you need a registry, because how else are you going to contain them?
Could you clarify? So you mentioned descriptive information, metadata, and attributes. What would a software name or a software version, is that descriptive, is that metadata, or is that an attribute? How would you describe that?
So well, it's metadata that has a specific format, right? So in SEMVer, you have a major version, dot minor version, dot what was it called? Patch, right? And then you can also add descriptive information. It's a grammar that's defined. Now that's nice, but you still have to be able to find the information, right? So you need some type of registry that any application or controller knows to go to look for, to see, give me all the possible descriptive information for this networking element.
Okay. Again, so you something like the software name, software attribute, or software version, that's metadata in your definition. Okay, so my words were imprecise. We're talking about the same thing. When I talk about descriptive information, you're saying metadata. I think we mean the same thing in this particular case.
We do.
Okay.
I'm suggesting that you use metadata to describe those information, and that way you don't get into, well, this vendor formats it this way, and this vendor formats it that way, and this vendor doesn't even have that attribute, right?
Right. Yes. So you're absolutely correct that we need a common sort of structure's the wrong word, but I'm blanking on a better one. You know, we need how about a common data model? Information model, a common information model into which all this information is placed. And we also have to allow for the possibility that information that's available, metadata that's available for one piece of software is not necessarily going to be available for it.
Exactly.
Okay.
Hence the registry, right? So in I2NSF, Hank and I have been trying to align terminologies and things. We have this notion of capabilities, right? So the device may be able to report on the following subjects, but only if some, a flag is set or condition enabled. It doesn't need to report on all of those unless you're specifically asking for it, right? Bigger threat window, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay.
I mean, attack surface, sorry.
And to finally, this registry that you're talking about, this registry is a registry of the metadata, I'm going to use the word fields, as opposed to the metadata values.
Correct.
Okay. So it's basically would it be correct to say that it is an expression of that information model that everyone agrees upon, not necessarily, it's not a registry of all of the software's versions and names and all the information that goes into that information model. Am I correct in that?
Absolutely.
All right.
Okay. Sorry.
No, this is very good. I get confused easily, so I like to push down on this. Okay, thank you.
Dave Woltermeyer. I came up to the mic to actually answer Hank's original question about payload versus evidence tags and identifiers, and whether it would, whether an evidence-based identifier would consistently identify the same software. So the expectation is that when you have an evidence-based tag, that it's generated by some discovery tool that has a recognition library for software, so that if it sees certain evidence of that software being present on the device, that it would then identify the software based on its knowledge of that software. And so in doing so, it would actually identify the same software using its same identifier. Now, granted, that identifier won't be globally unique for the software because that identifier is only relevant inside that discovery tool. But the expectation is that the discovery tool would consistently identify the software every time it sees it, no matter which endpoint it's seeing the software on. So from that perspective, within a given organizational management domain, you could expect the same discovery tool to report the same identifier whenever it sees the same piece of software. So it would be consistent in that case.
But would the identifier, the tag ID, be the same? The metadata should be the description, but
right. The identifier I'm referring to is the tag ID.
Yeah, but if it would re-identify the software, would it create the same identifier?
I think it should. In fact, there is wording in the current version of the SWID M&A specification that says when, and again, this was assuming that we were using ISO SWID tags. We need to generalize that, but it does say that if you are using generated information, what you would call evidence, that you need to be consistent in your creation of the identifier associated with it.
This is important. And also thinking about it, it's kind of obvious that it's impossible to resolve evidence SWID tags via the identifier because you just created them on the target endpoint. The only place where the description, the descriptive information is located is now in that evidence tag on the target endpoint. And if we would then just transfer the ID, you could not resolve it from a central component because only the target endpoint at that moment of time contains the description. You have to transport, of course, that description to the repository and then can work with only the ID and resolve it. So that, of course, is not possible with evidence.
Well, no, you just described exactly how it's possible. That if you've got a locally generated ID, you have to resolve it on the entity that created that locally generated ID. So yes.
Kathleen Moriarty, AD. So what I'm wondering is, you probably don't have enough yet, right, to make a decision. I'm wondering, and just a question back to you before the chairs think of ways to form any kind of ways to help you on this. Is a decision necessary? Can this be done in something that we publish that doesn't require this decision to be made now, but that it can be decided by those using it later, just to make some progress? Because we've been talking about identifiers for I don't know how long now.
Well, so the question
it's a tough issue, and I realize that.
This came up from me trying to get some precision regarding a data structure, and more than half of the conversation focusing on formats for unique identifiers. And I was trying to determine whether or not this was actually, in some regard, a digression, or whether it reflected the group's actual consensus on the issue. From what I have been hearing in this discussion, it sounds like we do need, call it metadata, call it descriptive information. That there needs to be a way to convey that information. So I think I have heard consensus on that, and I think that which will allow us to go on to the next slide, which is starting to get some consensus on what that descriptive information looks like, because that is critical for the specification.
So I'm not sure you have consensus. How about the chairs? Do you think he has consensus? Because there's only a few people that stood up. Yeah, I mean, you guys are tracking this much closer, and I was on leave, so maybe you have a.
Yeah, so it's a tough question to answer at this point, I think. However, it's taking the hat off for a second. You need to be able to resolve.
Yeah, the reason.
Does it need to be resolved?
No, I'm sorry. This question doesn't necessarily need to be resolved, but the question about do we need just the ID or the metadata you need to be able to get to the metadata to tell what the ID relates to. So to me, it's kind of like again, hat off, right? It's almost like a moot point. Like, yeah, of course, we need to say that 42 points to a Windows server.
Right.
Right.
But how it's done.
How it's done, if it comes from the endpoint or not, doesn't matter to me. Like, I think some places are going to want it.
The question,
implementation detail.
Yeah, the question I'm trying to resolve is whether there needs to be any discussion of a data model being conveyed at all. If the answer, and this is what some people seem to be discussing on the list, if the answer is that there is no structured information, it's just a list of identifiers, then the next few slides, then we don't need to talk about the data model here. Then that can be punted off to discussions of the SACM information model, and that's good enough. If the answer is that these messages actually need to convey this descriptive information, this metadata, then we need to have some agreement as to what that looks like, because we need to describe that in the payload of the document. So that's what I'm trying to pin down here.
Okay, and was SWID decided upon?
No. Was ISO SWID 2015 decided upon? No, and that's where this sort of whole question of data model comes in. But if we're only going to be using identifiers, then that becomes moot, because we don't need to discuss it. So that's why I'm trying to pin this down right now, to see whether or not we actually need to be talking about what this data model looks like in this group.
I'm going a step further back even.
Okay.
So if it's SWID or something else, could you just have a space for whatever that is going to be, SWID or something else, and move on and let implementers decide? Can it be done like that?
That was actually one of the early suggestions in the group. Gunnar raised and multiple people supported the idea that there should be a specific data model used, rather than sort of an open-ended field where people could put their own data model into this specification. We could certainly revisit that, but my sense of the discussion was that there was largely consensus that this document, or this specification, should identify a specific data model for representation of this information.
All right, it seems like it's gone on long enough. Hopefully that the chairs have a plan to help resolve this, because it seems like it's at a higher level than just this document. Thanks. And I'm sure they already did, but.
Thank you.
Dave Waltermeyer, I just wanted to speak to the question of do we need the ability to resolve an identifier to metadata? So something that's talked about in our charter and the requirements, maybe in the architecture, I'd have to go back and check, but is this idea of pre-assessment and assessment targeting. And in order to support those kinds of capabilities, you need to be able to characterize the software that you're ultimately assessing the configuration of, or any other state. And typically, identifying a piece of software by just a unique identifier is insufficient to be able to support those kinds of targeting use cases, because you effectively have to enumerate every possible instance of the software by its identifier. So, a vendor will often release, multiple versions of software. It'll be patched, and these are all operations that often affect the identification of the software. You would have to know about every possible version that would exist, unless you can describe more abstract concepts like, the vendor of the product, the name of the product, and other higher level abstractions about the software, because that allows you then to group, to create a group essentially around those identifiers and refer to a set of software, not an instance of software. And it's for that reason that we actually need this metadata to be resolvable so that we can do those kinds of targeting exercises. So without it, we wouldn't have that capability.
Yeah, and Kathleen, this is why I was claiming that this is actually resolved, because ultimately that we have consensus on this, because ultimately everyone who's come up and stood up has described a situation where maybe, as Jim said, you don't need to do the resolution, but it must, at some level, there has to be the ability to understand what has just been reported, that just a unique identifier is maybe insufficient for some use cases, and if that's the case, then the ability to send descriptive information is critical. And I think I didn't hear anyone say that unique identifiers are fully sufficient. So that's why what I'm hearing is consensus that at the very least we do need the ability to convey metadata, even if every use case and every situation doesn't require that metadata to be conveyed, that an identifier may be sufficient in some situations, but it's never going to be sufficient in all situations.
So Chris Nacio, Carnegie Mellon. So there's three options. There's UIDs only, big payload only, or both. And it sounds like everybody's saying both. Can we actually hum on both? Is there not three options? I understand hum's really much better served by having A or B, but
well, no, I think that is exactly what the current draft of the specification does. It supports both, and that's what I was hearing. So Jim was observing that it's not necessary to report resolved, descriptive information every single time. I've heard a lot of people saying that, when you can get away with it, identifiers are great. They're more efficient. You don't want the overhead, but at the same time, there may be situations where you need the metadata because the identifier is not enough, and you want to be able to control when you get which, and that's actually what's currently there.
Okay, I think one of the things that we need to do here is we need to be clear about exactly what we're asking and what the consensus is that we're representing. And I think we're kind of struggling with what that list of options actually is. And I'd like to start with you clearly stating to me what do you think the question should be? And Chris, stay up there for a minute.
When you say what should the question be, what are we trying to get consensus around, you ask? What I want to get consensus around is whether the specification, currently called SWID message and attributes, although potentially confusingly named at this point.
Fewer words.
Sorry.
Just
when inventory is reported, do we always use unique identifiers? Do we always use descriptive information, or do we allow both? That's my question.
And
so my take from everything everyone said is allow both.
So what I'm trying to do right now is figure out what the options are, and then we can figure out who thinks what.
Okay. Yeah, so those align to the three I just said.
So those align to your three. Unique IDs, descriptive IDs, or both?
Yes.
Descriptive
descriptive metadata.
Thank you. So, okay.
Well, and does that ID need to be identified in advance? So if we come down to an identifier, do we have to pick that?
I think that falls out of the question. If we're
I disagree, because I just don't want to be sitting on this list watching arguments about SWID for another year.
So you all are going to have to
you and me both.
So one of the advantages of having me with my inaccurate articulation of the language clarify this is that you're going to have to be really precise. So unique IDs, descriptive information, both of these, and does it need to be done in advance? identified in advance, does he?
This is Dave Woltmeyer. Is identified in advance a separate question, or is that a fourth option?
I think it's a orthogonal.
Yeah.
Okay.
So are the two gentlemen in line? Are you going to say something to clarify these options or state opinions about the options?
I want to add an option.
You want to add an option? Okay, hold on one.
Yeah, just making it more complicated.
Right, yeah.
No, I will not.
Simplicity is a wonderful thing.
Yeah,
Okay.
my option is a little bit more simple because it says it doesn't matter if it's 1, 2, or 3 on your list. You should focus on if it's target endpoint created or if it's vendor created. You have to the use cases are absolutely different between that created on the endpoint or supplied by vendor.
Could you elaborate on that? I'm not sure I
You
agree.
have to transport descriptive information. This is not an option if they're created on the target endpoint.
Yes.
So the question is not if you want to have the ID or want to have the description, it is how the SWID is created, if it's coming from the vendor or if it's created on the endpoint. That is the only deciding factor. The rest should be, as I stated at the beginning, as I think as Kathleen also said, immaterial to the problem. It is not of importance. It does not have to be decided. It's about both and focus on what does the SWID express. Is it a measurement on the endpoint or is it a template that should be so as the software package from the vendor?
Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I was just going to speak to what Hank just said. I don't know if it matters whether it's. So it matters in one sense if we consider the vulnerability assessment scenario, whether it's a publicly recognized identifier or not, because there's a desire to be able to reference things like that identifier in a vulnerability record, vulnerability description, and in order to do that, there has to be public agreement on how you identify a piece of software, which predicates really that it exists a priori. Does it have to be assigned by the vendor? No, but it does have to. There has to be some public agreement on the identifier.
So one way of rephrasing what Hank said was, don't overload the purpose of an ID. An ID just says that this attribute is unique. Doesn't say anything about format or content or context, right? And so for me to be able to use an ID to infer something is just plain wrong. I would argue that yes, you can use an ID as long as you know how to resolve it and point to something interesting, but this is why I prefer metadata information. And then if you use metadata information, since no one's going to agree on what's important and what isn't, you need some type of registry so that you can search for the metadata, because Hank may want to use A, B, and D as a unique key, and I might want to use A, E, and F, right? Okay. Neither of us are wrong, but we can always find it and resolve it if there's the registry.
So can I ask this? Does it make sense? I haven't moved.
Hey, I've only had 1 cup of coffee. Give me a break. Well, 2, I lied. Jesus.
So to me, there's a set of questions around, does this need to be done in advance or not, which are orthogonal to what the 3 options are. And to me, part of what you're saying answers the question of what does this need to be decided in advance or not. Can we simplify it down to that question?
I hope so.
Okay. So can we ask the question first then, does the second set of questions need to be answered in advance or not? Is that a clear question that people in the room feel that they can hum to?
To clarify what you're asking, does the question of does this report unique identifiers? Does it report descriptive information? Or does it do both? Does that need to be decided in advance or not? Is that what you're asking?
Yes. So so we have one set of questions, which is it unique IDs, descriptive information, or both? And then we have a second conversation around, does it matter what it is, or does it need to be identified in advance?
So as far as answering this, absolutely needs to be decided, because we don't know what the message is going to look like unless we know this, is my answer. When I heard Hank talking about identified before or after, what I heard was not so much about this as whether what is reported by message and attributes is preset, potentially by the vendor, potentially by someone, but basically published on the endpoint, and we collect and report what is published on the endpoint. We just collect it. We don't evaluate it. Or if we are collecting evidence from the endpoint and reporting the evidence that we discovered. So to use the example that's used in ISO SWID tags, are we using a authoritative SWID tag that is published by the vendor, installed on the endpoint? We just scrape up this information and publish it. Or are we using SWID tags as effectively a data model in which anyone, maybe the RPM generates its SWID tags, maybe someone else generates its SWID tags. Are we doing that? And I think that's what, and I'm getting a nod from Hank, that's what he meant by decided before or decided afterwards. And to answer that question, I think that the answer is we need to be able to accommodate both. Because I don't think that we will get sufficient information if we rely on vendor pre-provisioned information, that there will not be enough tags on the endpoint to get a useful inventory at that point. Today. Maybe someday, but today that's the case. And I got another nod from Hank, so I'm feeling really good right now. So go ahead.
Bob Moskowitz, AG Consulting, working for Huawei. You just triggered a thought here as we've been trying to follow this discussion. And is within the potential scope you're looking at this, that this information would be published by the endpoint such that the collector would then be able to subscribe to be able to get that specific class of profiling? So we're actually potentially looking at a pub sub model here for this this information collection by using these identifiers for saying, this is the sort of thing that I can provide about myself. Are you interested in this?
So the current draft of SWID message and attributes does support pub sub, wherein a subscriber could say, let me know about any inventory events, or give me a fresh inventory when certain things happen. And it can also subscribe to say, give me inventory events that are associated with the following identifiers. So which effectively translates to, I'm interested in these specific software applications. Let me know if something interesting happens to them, but I don't necessarily care about the complete inventory. So yes.
And so I can see in that where your last bullet point becomes not a question mark, but an exclamation point.
Yes, because for a subscription model, if you want to do what the specification refers to as targeted subscriptions, where you're only interested in specific things, you really do need an identifier for that. You can't do that.
And hierarchical or not, you need, depending on the situation, they both are appropriate.
So yeah, thank you very much. So I think that we do actually have consensus here on a both.
So just one
here. No.
Right. So, sorry.
Karen, can I ask one question?
Yes.
Could we ask the question, can anyone, is everyone willing to live with both?
Oh, we could ask that question. So just as a quick, wow, you're gone.
Sorry. standing back.
The pink box is kind of awkward. So one of the things that I feel a bit like we're going in circles, and I'm struggling to keep up with the circles that we're going in. So I would like to go back. I kind of want to be clear that for things that we want to, if there's something that we're going in circles on, then we need to be clear when we're asking for consensus and actually getting that consensus.
Yes.
I think different people have interpretations of what the consensus might be. And that's why I'm trying to clarify the question and to be sure that we get the answer that you're looking for.
Please. Yeah.
I kind of liked Dave's question. It's a yes or no question. Can you live with both? I probably shortened it a little bit too far, but is that a clear enough question that people think they can hum to? Can you live with both as an answer? So, yes, you can live with both. Hum. Oh, Kathleen's going to the mic. That's dangerous.
I'm trying to move to a place where I can hear better.
Oh, okay. Okay, so we had the hum for the yeses. Now hum for no if you can't live with both as the answer. I think we have consensus. Let's move to the next slide.
Please. All right. Next slide. All right. Live with both. So we're going to do both. So this gets to the question I would try and ask on the mailing list that led to the previous one. So descriptive structures. So we need the metadata. This is, I believe, what you were talking about when you talked about a registry. We need a definition. Gunnar strongly recommended that there be a information model in which this information is reported. I would argue this should be the same as the SACM information model, that there shouldn't be two information models for the same information within SACM. So based on that, I raised that the XML schema for the ISO SWID 2015 spec could serve as a data model. There was not unanimous agreement on the mailing list, we'll put it that way. There was, Jerome mentioned the possible use of that he had prior experience creating something called exorcism, and I've asked him to speak on that. Jerome, are you on the phone? All right, we may not have that, or something else. So I guess my first question is: has anyone in the room looked at the free ISO SWID 2015 specification? Hank, I know you can raise your hand. Dave, yeah, okay. All right. So we've got about, looks like 4 people. Of the people who raised your hand, do you have any concerns about how the ISO SWID 2015 specification, about the use of that specification as the basis of a data model for containing the metadata, the descriptive information, however we want it? Are there any concerns about that? Okay. Are you heading to the mic? All right, we got someone heading to the mic.
I'm not really familiar with the specification, but is the whole specification free or just the schema free?
The whole specification is not free. What you've got free is a documented XML schema, and NIST also published a guidance on standardized usage of the specification, but the specification itself is an ISO document you have to pay, I think, $120 for.
Okay, thanks.
John Romashkanu. So my take is that my answer is that on the technical side, I believe that it's a good starting point. I'm not sure that the schema itself, without the document, actually is enough to have an articulated discussion about it, not to speak about the further development process.
Could you elaborate what's missing? What would you like to see that's not there?
Well, beyond the schema, it's actually a kind of the use cases and the rationale, because the schema is kind of, well, it's a schema, so the level of documentation is what it is.
Okay. So I will note that a large amount of what's in the specification is in fact not relevant to our uses because it deals with the, effectively the life cycle of these documents, when they should be installed, when they should be removed. We're not, as far as this specification is concerned, we are not concerned with how, where that evidence comes from. We are simply we are simply trying to capture a way of representing the data. So I'm not fully disagreeing with you, but I will note that there is a lot there that we don't care about.
Yeah, so just kind of maybe to clarify what I was saying. The ISO specification, so for the people in this room that come and didn't read, so I believe that it's everybody minus 4 or 5 people. You need to have some background information about the ISO specification, what it was, why it was developed, what it is targeted, what are kind of the other use cases that those people had in mind, because it was developed for something that is like 90% different of what we are looking for.
Dave Waltmeyer. Dan, I was actually on the ISO committee that developed the specification. Interesting enough, the document doesn't contain any use cases. That's one of the reasons why I wrote the NISTer that we referenced on the list, was to provide a lot of that background material, the rationale for why the standard was created, to describe some of the use cases for the standard. So that document should actually be, I think, a good reference to understand that context. It is freely available. We also wrote it largely to supplement the schema to provide not a complete, but a reasonable guide to understanding the SWIT-tag data model. And it should be adequate for our needs here in SACM.
Okay, so what you're saying, I think the question was basically, is there a source of the semantics around that schema? And what you're suggesting is that NIST, I think it's an IR, right?
Yeah.
That NIST document provides sufficient semantics for the schema for our purposes.
I believe so, yes.
Okay. Has anybody else read that NIST document? Nobody? One person? 2 people?
Hank's raising his hand.
Okay.
All right.
Should probably do that.
So, okay. So we've heard that. Does anyone have, so there's always the possibility of just rolling our own, which is actually what has been started in the SACM information model. They've started to enumerate a list of metadata associated with software. Does anyone else have an existing publication, specification, standard that they think would be a good way to capture data, metadata about software, the descriptive side of things, not the identifier, not a unique identifier format, a descriptive format? Does anyone have one of those? All right. In that case, I will ask the chairs if we can get a call for and I know Kathleen will stab me if I'm doing this wrong, but oh, good, they're closer too. If we can get a call whether there is consensus on developing something on our own, akin to the information model, or if there is consensus on SWID 20 ISO, using the freely available information on ISO SWID 2015 as the basis of the data model. So there's a question first.
Yeah, just one. This is Joe Salloway. One question is, I'm a little bit catching up here. So how does the ISO standard relate to CPE, Common Platform Enumeration? Are those two things meeting together, or?
So there is, Dave, is there a MISTER on converting between being developed? I believe there is. So Dave can answer this better than I can.
CPE, this is Dave Woltmeyer. CPE, the Common Platform Enumeration. So that was a specification that we developed at NIST, I don't know, 8 years ago or so, with quite a bit of input from the community. Currently, our team at the NVD is doing the bulk of the CPE assignments today. And effectively how it works is when we see a vulnerability, we try to identify the products that are vulnerable, and our analysts create a CPE name for those. CPE name is a segment of 11 different strings that represent various metadata attributes of a software. So it's very labor intensive for us to actually produce these. So we actually started a spec. We have a draft of it. There's a NISTer out there. I can't remember the name. It's like 8057 or something like that. And what it does is it tells you how to mechanically generate a CPE name based on metadata that's provided in a SWID tag. So the idea is a vendor would publish a SWID tag for their software. We could consume those, mechanically generate a CPE name, publish that to the CPE dictionary that the NVD maintains. That would get us out of doing this manual CPE curation and generation process. I'll send that spec to the list.
Yeah, so that would be great.
8085 is the number. It's still in draft, so if anyone has any comments on it, we could certainly appreciate that. But yeah, that would be a mechanism to create CPEs out of SWID tags.
Are we rushing the gate and trying to choose a data model at this point? Is choosing a data model for this going to heavily influence the data model we choose for the rest of the information model in SACM?
Heavily rushing seems. Go ahead.
I was. Go ahead. I did have a good answer.
You did? Well, I don't want to forego.
She
your
would
good
appreciate
answer.
your good answer.
I was just thinking that heavily rushing doesn't seem to apply to much of what we're doing. So perhaps mine was not a good answer.
So if it certainly would be possible, I think, to finish off this specification simply saying that the payload, when descriptive information is published, is equal to a subset of the SACM information model that we precisely bound, but is effectively the software descriptive information. I think we could simply write the specification and say that's what we do, and note that until the information model is itself published, that this will sort of be a specification that cannot be implemented. But yes.
So I will tell you that from Kathleen's perspective, before she walked out the door, what she said to me was, it's been a rat hole for a long time. And that as long as we make the decision in a fair poll, then I think she's going to be happy with it. So I don't think it hurts to at least poll the room to see where we are.
But on that note, so that I think gives us three options. Option one is ISO SWID 2015 schema. Option two is define our own fields. Option three is defer. That there will be a defined structure, but we will let the information model people define it rather than try to define it here. Is that what I'm hearing?
Can I ask some clarifying questions on that?
Please.
Yes.
This is Dave Waltmeyer. Regardless of what data model we decide to use, we still need an information model that describes software metadata. Because I believe in the long run, it's ultimately that information model that will be doing things like evaluation and other things against. So I don't think it's a both, it's an either or. I think we could document a subset of elements in the information model and choose a data model that's more robust than that. And that would meet our need, essentially.
Would that create a situation where the data model reporting in this is capable of reporting more information than the information model is capable of expressing?
Yeah, I think that's perfectly acceptable, at least in my personal opinion.
Okay. So as long as the data model is at least a superset, then it's fine. If it's a subset, obviously that's a problem. But
Right.
okay.
So I would like to focus the question around the data model question. And then the information model, at some point, we're going to have to figure out what the subset that gets described in the information model actually is. I don't believe we have to answer that question right now.
Okay. But to go back to Jim's original question, with assuming there's agreement on that, and I'm not saying there is, because you get slapped if you say things like that from this mic. Jim's question remains, I think, valid. Do we need to decide this now, or can we simply say, here there is a agreed upon data model. We can write the rest of the specification just saying data goes here. That's more or less the way it's written right now. So do we need to decide this now? So, Jim?
I mean, my personal preference in terms of steps would be decide what items go in the information model, then decide what the data model looks like. Because that, I think, is the order things need to get done, because that may influence whether there are things which are not currently in the data model which need to be there, among other things.
And
yeah, if we're going to do a superset, then we should probably do the subset first. Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
So,
and I believe that starting with the SWID date with the current SWID spec is a reasonable place to start. This is a list of things in it. Which things need to be in the data model, which things don't need to be, or in the information model, which things don't need to be information model. Oh, we missed this one.
okay, so let me ask two potentially inaccurate questions then. Just for you, Jim. As a group, are we comfortable with? Is there consensus to use ISO SWID 2015 as a starting point? Can everybody hum?
In the information model or in the data model here? So, sorry. In the information model.
I'm going to get.
Okay, sorry.
Pardon? So hum for yes. Hum for no. Is there consensus that we need to develop the information model and then do the detailed, and then do the data model? Hum for yes. Hum for no. Okay. Is there something else you needed to answer questions on this slide?
No.
All right, let's move on.
Okay.
Next slide.
I don't even remember what I'm talking about next. We got 6 minutes. I'm not sure this is a discussion that we can complete in this time. So maybe it's going to be more fruitful to ask if anyone else has questions about the specification as written, outside of the data model, the use cases, the flow, the information flows. Are there any concerns about that? And we'll just bring this conversation to the list, because I think that this is yet another long one. Go ahead.
Next slide.
I don't think there's anything. Yeah, next slide. All right. So, despite what's on this, so as indicated, we can get the new specification written up in a significantly more data model agnostic way. I will do that. I think that a parallel conversation can be usefully started in the information model about the nature of what constitutes the software subset around which everything's built. Sounds like we've got a starting point for that conversation, which is good. Yeah, I will get a new draft out ahead of whenever the next virtual interim meeting is. All right.
Thank you. So we're up on
Yes.
welcome to the square.
Big enough to dance. Do you want to get started?
Yes, please, go ahead.
All right, so we'll just dive right in. So basically this time we're going to switch it up a little bit and talk about the open issues first. Thanks, Jim, for that feedback. Trying to make sure we get through these without running too much into the status. And then we'll go into the next steps. So to kind of kick things off, so based on some feedback on the list, we made some updates to the IPFix syntax, which is what we are currently using to represent the different information needs in the information model. So we originally started with basically all of the fields in or properties, I guess, in the IPFix specification template. We have since, after kind of looking at them and kind of, playing with some different information elements that we're defining, whether or not we actually need some of these. It kind of just adds additional complexity, and we're kind of getting to the point where, unless we have a really good reason to keep it, maybe simpler is better. So the way it works out now, basically everything with the strike through it, we have taken out. So there's basically 2 open questions out of, the discussion on the list as far as what we want to do for the template properties. And that the first one is, so basically the way the information model works, we have subjects, which are basically kind of, or I guess maybe it's either start, we have attributes, which are basically name value pairs. And then we have subjects, which are kind of complex mixture of, groupings of attributes or other subjects. And so because of that, there is some structure built into that. And we were originally in our design, or I guess our template, we had this information embedded in a prose description, and that makes things possibly, difficult to parse, and maybe it's better off if it's in a separate field where it can be processed more easily. So I guess that's one question we need to answer here is, in addition to that, for the structure for the subjects, do we also want to do something similar for potentially flags, which I think right now are kind of captured in tables. But maybe there's other structures that may come in the future that we want to support. Maybe there's a better way to do this. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that. Okay. Well, all right, since it's pretty quiet, I think maybe we'll just move forward with supporting the structure for the subjects, and then maybe flags as well. And I'll toss that out to the list and see what people think there. It's a very easy change. I don't think it will be too big of a deal, so we can just see where that goes. And then the other question we had with regard to the template was, so we have this status property, which basically describes, whether or not particular information element is, current, being actively used, or it's in a deprecated state. There's feedback asking, whether or not we could kind of update this to say this information element was added in version X or it was deprecated in version Y. Again, that's a simple change. The other thing to consider there is the IPFix syntax does have this revision and date property built in. Basically, the revision tracks, the information element as it's updated, and then the date covers when it was added into the registry.
Dave Waltmeyer, clarifying question. What does the revision number correspond to?
Every time the information element is updated.
Yeah, but a new draft or a new RFC would update the information model.
Yeah.
So how would we, tie a given RFC?
No, so that's incorrect. The way the IPFix information models get updated is via expert review, so it no longer needs an RFC. Only when you add a major collection of elements to the system do you need an RFC. So all proposals now to add small numbers of information elements, et cetera, are just suggested, and they go through expert review and then submitted to IANA after expert review.
And they're not specification required?
They are not specification required, and the revisions often resolve relatively small nuances as to like MPLS labels, or maybe there's a small fix in there. Sorry, Chris Inacio, Carnegie Mellon. And so the fields are used so that you can track how those schemas get updated on the IANA site, and how you can include that into IPFix, emitters, collectors, et cetera.
So the version is just an incremented integer for every batch of updates, something like that, or?
No, so when certain fields were actually like clarified, some time date specs, some other specs within there, and those fields were versioned.
So I guess one question I have, since you're more familiar with IPFix than I am, is this also, with the expert review, is that a way to kind of maybe not expedite, but more, I guess, in a more scalable way,
so
grow
it allows
as
a couple of things. It is faster.
Yeah.
It only requires there's a couple of folks who are nominated as experts for expert review. IPFix, I think, maybe was one of the early ones that did this, but there's a couple of other schemas that IANA maintains that now operate this way. The IPFix working group is closed down, but the expert review still exists. So you can close down the working group and you can still maintain the schema and do the updates. So it's efficient in that regard as well. So it does those kind of things.
Yeah, no, that seems really important. Just going on past experience working with things like Oval, where we have to constantly update it as new features are added to platforms and things like that. So that's
right.
good.
So there's a couple of people who are core in the IPFix who are the expert review.
Okay, thanks. Jim, did you have a question? No, just hanging out.
Next one.
Yeah, we can go to the next slide. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. John Strassner. Same comments here as before. I think it's good to be able to track when something was deprecated. I'd recommend you take a look at semver.org, and because that's much more of standardized way of doing revisions. And the elements up there, once again, are really metadata, right? So,
Yeah.
so I encourage you in the first one to just make the template the data that's inherent to the object, and then have an ability to augment information elements with metadata, and then you can standardize something that's tricky like data type semantics, right? Because the semantics might be context sensitive.
All right, thanks. Yeah, we'll skip to the next slide.
So Chris Nacio, just to explain how IPFix does that, there's a secondary thing in information where you can send an options message, which can actually express. So if you want to add a proprietary information element or an extension, so we don't handle metadata the way you just described. Instead, you can send an options template across that actually can describe metadata about meta typing information across, so that you can then send an information element, and it can have a textual description along with kind of the data type and unit information. You can almost, to some extent, send across a new data, an information element metadata, so that you can then express it. So what that means, but the advantage of doing it that way is that the receiver then actually has, in a structured way, you don't have to try and textually parse out fields. Instead, you have structured information present that's machine to machine understandable to be able to process those extensions, as opposed to adding attributes and that kind of stuff in an unstructured way that can't be machine processed.
I guess I kind of disagree, but this is a longer discussion, so maybe we can take it offline.
All right, yeah, not a problem. All right, so can we hop over to the next slide, I guess?
No, sorry.
Oh, no problem. So another question that was brought up on the list was what we want to do for naming conventions. I think this, personally, doesn't matter to me. We just got to pick something based on, this is basically the 4 rules for the IPFix syntax naming conventions. I think there's a 5th one, but kind of everyone was in agreement that they didn't want to use it. But these are the 4. Basically should be descriptive. I think that's, I think we kind of definitely need that's obvious. Whether or not, it has to be unique and, how to deal with vendor specific names. I think that all makes sense. Really, the only point of contention was just, what we use for the format. Right now, it starts with a lowercase letter and every preceding component of that name starts with a capital letter. I don't even know that this is worth discussing too much beyond just pointing it out. I'll send an email to the list and maybe just say, here's a couple options, pick one, and we can see what we get. Because to me, it just seems pretty immaterial.
Dave Woltemeyer, this mostly looks good, but how do we deal with collisions with vendor name?
So there's enterprise ID associated with the information elements, and that's supposed to be used to stop collisions. That's one way you're required to have that with. So if there's a SACM software ID, and then a vendor makes their own software ID, it'll have their vendor ID name or number associated with it. And then here, they also, prefer if you prefix it with your vendor name. So that could do it as well.
So the vendor ID would be better than the name because
I would say so, yeah.
There's a registry for that, right?
Yep.
Do we want to update this to use the vendor ID instead then?
Yeah, we can make that more explicit if people are on board with that. All right, we can just go to the next slide. So then the third issue, it's kind of the last open question, I think, with the IPFix syntax. So basically, we sucked in a bunch of data types for my IPFix into the information model. Those are them there, nothing too crazy. We started to define a couple of other ones with respect to software version identifiers, not in the sense of like a SWID tag or anything, but an RPM, for example, has its own special format for the version, and it's not just a simple dot delimited list or something like that. So we just started to define those, and basically we also had a request for adding a data type for a URI array and a map. We haven't done anything with those yet, but that's something that could be supported, assuming the working group's good with that. These are things that we'll just pull in over time. I think we kind of already talked about the IPFix semantics a little bit. Basically, we pulled them out, but if, for the sake of simplicity, but if people do have strong opinions that we really, really need them, I guess we'd like to hear that as well too. Maybe even better, give a few examples of, why they're definitely needed. So I guess, does anyone have any thoughts on any of those things, any data types they want to request?
Joe Salloway again. So do we need to define additional, like this RPM version and Cisco train separate from SWID? Or is that gonna be, I guess?
So I think with SWID, I think they have a single version string and it's broken up into like a major, minor component, or is that?
This is Dave Waltermeyer. No, it's just a plain string, but it's actually a tuple of information because it identifies the version as a string, but then it has a version scheme attribute that defines the syntax of it's an identifier for the syntax of the version. So the idea would be using that scheme identifier, you could then parse the version based on whatever the corresponding structure is. So it might show you what the epoch version revision format. Right. So like semver is one of the allowed values, but there's a handful of others that can be used. I would suggest that we should probably use something similar to that here. Instead of explicitly enumerating every possible version scheme that exists out there, use some similar method to what's used in a SWID tag to just allow the version scheme to be declared.
Chris Anasio, CMU, I vote against what Dave said. Simply because all you're actually doing is saying, here's a relatively opaque string, and here's a parser description that you should then go off and write from the receiver to go parse it. So I would actually like to, my personal opinion is the more structure we can enforce in the exchange, then the easier it is to make things work. The other version is the software on either side becomes more challenging to write and get correct because you are forcing people to write parsers everywhere.
Why are we talking about an exchange though? This is an information model, not a data model.
I have a question. How are you thinking you're planning to use this version string in general? Are you going to say, compare these two things with the two things here with these two things here? If they're the same, I've got some actions I need to look at potentially. I mean, are we actually, from an information model point of view, do we care if they are anything other than opaque in general?
I would say yes, because if you have a vulnerability, you want to know if it's greater than or later than X, Y, or Z, which means instead of just saying, is this one version vulnerable, what's normally the case is versions prior to this are vulnerable.
Okay.
Right? Which means you do have to parse that string.
Yeah. And what I kind of want to, I mean, right now, naming of these things is really hard. I mean, it's just knowing which, it's difficult to do. And I'd like to not increase the number of different identifiers.
Dave Woltermeyer, +1 to that. And the other thing that's hard is doing less than and greater than comparisons of arbitrary, versions, because that's something that we've studied pretty heavily. And there's lots of complicated version schemes out there that are practically impossible to do that with. Simple semver kinds of versions are much easier, but there's lots of them out there that'll throw a huge curveball.
So I guess it's still not clear to me where we stand as far as actually specifying, explicitly the different types of versions we care about versus, having a format that can be parsed and used to understand them.
So I think from a information model point of view, if you do that version, you really have you potentially have a version string information element, and then you have another information element that is, an enumeration of the different types that are in that string.
Okay. All right. Yeah,
So
that works.
I don't know how to better answer.
Oh, okay. Not a question. All right, we can go to the next slide. All right, so this is where it might get fun, maybe. I don't know. How much? 4 minutes? All right, so this is really the biggest question I had about the requirements. So there's a data model requirement basically saying that for each, a data model must support each element in an information model. And the big question to me, the way I interpreted it was, well, SWID's a data model, so it now must support everything in the information model beyond which, is everything, including, stuff related to software inventory, hardware inventory, configuration, things like that. And I think we could use some clarification there as far as whether or not that's how I should be reading that, or and I was actually talking to Hank yesterday, and we kind of were discussing, there's kind of two types of data models. There's one for the actual data we collect on the endpoint, things like software inventory, hardware inventory, whatever. And then there's also going to be a data model for dealing with, how do SACM components communicate, what's, how do they understand, what the different, capabilities they support, which data models that they implement, things like that, so you can better negotiate, the transfer of this information. Jim, did you have a question?
Jim Shutt. I don't actually personally see this as an issue because there's also an additional requirement someplace that says the data model can be composed of a top level with some plug-in modules below it. So if we consider the SWID M&A to be a subset of the final SACM data model, there's no issue.
Yeah, that's actually the second requirement. I do have that on the next slide as well, but okay, that's good to know. Do others have thoughts on this?
John Strassner, just a clarifying question. So if I've got a set of abstract classes and then the bottom subclass is concrete, typically what I do as a data modeler is collapse all of the abstract classes and the concrete class into one class. So on the one hand, I could say that your DM001 is met because implicitly, because everything's contained into the resulting object. On the other hand, if I read it literally, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, I maybe think I was reading it literally.
Then I would vote against that because most data model optimization, I mean, it depends how your information model is built, but I mean, using abstract classes is a good thing.
Yeah, I guess the way I envisioned it was, if you take it in the context, maybe take SWID for an example. SWID should implement all the information elements related to maybe software inventory information. Then, you could make the case that, hey, that meets that. But go ahead, Dave.
This is Dave Waltermeyer. I'm not sure how to interpret what data model element means. Do you define that for us?
I interpreted it as basically for, each element, or I guess maybe it could be something more complex that's not clear. It has to map to something in the information model.
So like, for example, if I have a serialization format that has the ability to express attributes that are name value pairs, as an example, if I had an attribute for an information model element, is that considered a data model element? I'm just not certain what that.
Yeah, no, that's probably something we need to figure out.
Does Nancy have anything to say about that? No.
So Dave just scared me.
I guess not.
So I guess when I read data model element, I was assuming the standard, class, attribute, constraint, association, method, relationship types of things. And that's why I asked my first question, because I would hope that you'd allow optimizations from the information model to the data model on that. You also have reverse optimizations, right? So I typically, I might have derived attributes in the data model that wouldn't show up in the information model, or hopefully wouldn't show up, right? So I think you maybe need some tighter language there. I'll help.
All right. Yeah, that'd be great.
Hey, Adam, this is Nancy. So I'm not sure what you want me to respond to, because there were several questions, topics. So I guess the way I view this is the information model should be the abstract version from which data models get instantiated. So from that standpoint, I agree, Danny, that the SWID is more of a data model than it is an information model. You asked before, I look at SWIDs as a subset of the SACM information model.
Yep, I agree with
as
that.
an instantiation of how we could represent software for SACM as a potential base, right?
So when you say for each information model element, you can, I guess, is the proper way to think of it, in the context of whatever, you're trying to solve, in this case, software inventory. So a software inventory data model should deal with all the software inventory information elements
there'll be context within what that software inventory is used for, right? So by context, I mean, are we using it for collection, for guidance, for evaluation, or for observed, right? So there has to be some guidance in the information model for how we can express that. And then the data model needs to instantiate.
Yeah, so basically it's not a data model must support the entire SACM information model.
Not in its whole entirety.
Yeah.
But within a context of when SACM refers to this is how we're going to represent software. That's what we mean by it better be a superset of that.
Yeah, so we may want to try to clarify that a little bit. I think it would be helpful, at least for me.
This is Hank speaking, and I think the third bullet point points to part of the problem why this is so confusing. If the information model would be a complete template for data models on the data plane, it would have to include every attribute, for example, SWID has in the data model because of the DM001. Because there's, for example, a corpus attribute for installation media in SWID, which probably doesn't make much sense for SACM. But if we say that every data model element for each information model element, so this is not by directional mapping, basically. So it is basically implied that I think the complete mapping of the information model is only necessary on the management plane when components talk between each other to query specific data models that then can have a larger set of elements than the information model, of course. But in order to get a common understanding how to get this information in a domain, we have to have these hooks. And these hooks are essentially defined by the information model. And so for what is spoken between SACM components, and not especially to the target endpoint, because basically NIA is taking care of that, requires you to somehow query that information. I want to have a SWIT tag. I want to have a timestamp related event or something. So in order to have that, you have to maybe have a data model that does the complete information model on the management plane in order to query that stuff or to talk about it, to emit it somehow and to orchestrate that. But on the data plane, this subset solutions are, I think, a good way to go forward. Like saying some elements of the SWITs go into the information model in order to retrieve that SWIT somehow, or talk to about, reference it, and bring it into context in the SACM domain. But the data model, the data model for SWIT has to be in the information model entirely for that. But this is nowhere written down. I think we still have the chance to refine the requirements in this regard.
Jim Schad. Talking about data models that aren't part of the whole gives me some upset stomach, because that kind of says that I'm going to have a real fun time at some point in the future when I say, I want a list of all the machines which have this particular piece of software on them with this particular version, and I want you to return the following information about the machine, the following information about the software, and guess what? I've got two independent data models coming back on me. That's just kind of not what I really wanted. I mean, I want one data model that's going to return all that information. So, I mean, if you want to have a SWID data model, which is not part of the SACM data model, I'm happy with that. I don't care. But if you want to say that the SWID data model is part of the SACM data model, then it needs to really be part of the SACM data model and meet all of these requirements. Nancy's unhappy with me.
No, I'm not. I'm just puzzled. So Nancy again. So the SWID only specifies today software. In SACM, we're saying we need to include software, hardware. So I'm just trying to understand your question. Is it that you're requesting that SWID be expanded, or?
I'm saying that if the SWID data model is not part of a data model which represents the entire information model, it is not part of the SACM data model.
Okay, so earlier when the group was
This is by the way, is
started.
why I said we were rushing to choose a data model, since we hadn't gotten an entire SACM data
Right.
model yet.
Well, so part of my confusion is I thought there was an admission when we first started the group that there would be more than one data model.
Yes, but
now
each data model has to be complete.
Okay, we were kind of nebulous. So you're
No,
saying.
we made two statements. Statement number one was that there can be more than one data model, but each data model has to be complete to the information model. Statement number two was a SACM data model could be constructed of sub-data modules put together.
Yeah, so my recollection is the first half of your statement, which was the admission, and again, it was because we wanted to leverage, and I'm just trying to understand, which is why I'm trying to get that clarification, right? So in the initial conversations, when we were working through the charter and what led us to, we need a single information model by which we can then base and evaluate the different data models. right, was we looked and at that point, we did have lots of stuff thrown, like oval, SWID wasn't even in the play, right? And so when we were talking about the different tasks, you could have a task that's only looking at software. And I think that's where SWID may apply, right?
And
So-
that task that's only looking at software is never going to care about anything that's not in the software, such as what machine it's on?
Such as what?
What machine it is on?
The hardware. Maybe
Who the
not.
user is?
I can't answer that right now. I mean, in the use cases and contexts that I'm living in, most of them do, but there are cases in which you might want to do a second verification on just observed, and in the just observed, maybe just give me the software version. Meaning, I'm not asking for the whole chain of, software belonging to a user, belonging to a hardware device, belonging, right?
Right, and what I'm saying is, if you don't call that a SACM-DM, I'm happy.
Can you repeat that last bit?
If you do not call something that is just dealing with software a SACM-DM, I'm happy. But if it's a SACM-DM, it has to deal with the entire SACM information model.
I see. Okay, so I'm sorry, I just want to interject. So I don't have that recollection at all. So my recollection is that there's a single information model, and that would be able to have a collection of data models, whether that's one data model or several, that would meet the information model. To me, it doesn't make sense that the software identification data model should do everything else in the information model.
What would you call maybe we're talking, what would you call, like if we just use SWID tags, obviously SWID tags don't contain user information, doesn't contain hardware information. If SWID M&A delivered that, you wouldn't call that a SACM data model, as you're saying. What would you call that?
A SWID data model.
Okay, but that would still be part of the SACM.
It could be a submodule in the SACM
Okay.
module, data module.
So we may be fighting about terms rather than.
Yeah, I think, so Jim, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I am.
No, please.
But to me, that says that this particular point is not interesting to me to argue.
Right. So I think what you're asking, Jim, is that we define, and I'm asking you the question, that we define only one SACM data model that's all comprehensive? And so when that, hold on, so that the SACM data model could be comprised of components that came out of SWID, that came out of other data models that provide different, but collectively, they can be construed as a SACM data model.
Yes.
Okay.
That I accept.
I wanted to try to clarify what we're talking about here, because I think we're talking about data models and data in the same context, right? So SACM needs to define a data model that defines the structure of how you express data, but every expression of data doesn't require that you use every part of the data model, right? Meaning that, so say we have this data model that's composed up of many different parts. When you express data using that model, you don't have to use every part, correct? So, does that help us get through this debate? Because we effectively can have one big data model, but only use parts of it to express data for any given exchange that we're doing.
Don Romashkano, so just to address what Dave just said, Since the intent here is actually to say that at the end of the day, at the end of the SACM development process, we'll have a data model that covers everything that was in the information model. This does not say anything about the structure of the data model. The data model can be and will probably be a modular thing. It will be composed of a concatenation of several data models. And Suite is part of it, but it's certainly not the data model for SACM because it's not covering the whole scope of the information model and the whole scope of SACM. It's looking at specific software identifier problems and section and developing the things that are around. So at the end of the day, we need to look at Suite and the model that is developed around as one of the modules that will define the data model that SACM needs to deliver at the end. And we may need to have some kind of an applicability statement development clause when we are done that actually explains how the different data model modules actually covers the information model.
Okay. Can I ask a question here? The beginning of this conversation was you asking the question, did we need to revisit the requirements because of the work you were doing for the information model, right? Yeah. So without going all the way back and discussing all of it, do we have a sense of what the answer to that question is? I mean, it seems to, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. You can finish.
You first.
I think based on the discussion.
Let me rephrase this. What do you think the answer to your question is? The question for me is, do we need to revisit requirements at some point? And I'm hoping the answer is no.
I took a note that we needed to clarify DM001 about the data model.
It's just not, like, I think someone just reading this without the context may not, get the same thing. So clarification may be useful.
Right. So your note was?
Yeah, there were a few folks that had suggested that we clarify that requirement to be more explicit about what we mean with the data model element. That was it.
So there's a single requirement that we think we need to clarify.
I would like to see it clarified.
Okay, go ahead, Nancy.
I'd like to see it clarified too.
You'd like to see it clarified. Nancy, would you like to see it clarified, or do you think it's?
I'm not sure. Well, so to Jim's point, right, if I read the first part of the sentence, the data model has to be complete. So there should be a mapping to all of the information model elements in the data model. And that, to me, is what it means to be complete.
Okay.
So we can't exclude any piece of the information model.
I guess part of my angst here is it's nice to have things sort of done and off your plate. And if I had been a little bit more proactive, this document would already be done and off our plates and well published. So is it really important to clarify this, or is this a nice to have?
Well, that's where I'm saying the way I'm reading what we put down, to me, that infers that there's a completeness mapping.
That's not what this says.
But I'm just saying how I'm interpreting how that reads is that there's a, not necessarily a one-to-one, but a completeness mapping. For each information element, there is a data model element. That's complete.
So the fact that there's two ways to interpret this might imply that it needs to be tightened.
Okay, I will take suggestions since I'm the editor for it, but.
Okay, I would like this to be a very narrowly focused question on how do we fix the one sentence in this document and not opening everything up again.
John Strassner. So I agree with Dave. That DM001, the problem is it doesn't say mapping.
Okay, so why don't we have that conversation on a mailing list?
Okay. And then on the third one, I agree with Hank, you really do need to differentiate between data and management plane. You could have two management entities that are, for example, exchanging information about how to perform a task. That has nothing to do with the actual endpoints that are requested to report data on that, right? And in fact, if the endpoints are given that information, you're widening your attack surface.
Okay.
And just a final request, this is Hank speaking. I would really like that if we clarify this, we are not ending up with that the switch has to contain hardware inventory because of this. I think this is not what we want.
No,
we do not want that the SWID data model has then to include the complete SACM information model. This is clearly, I think, understood that nobody in this room wants this. So this should not be the result in the end. So therefore.
Yes.
Okay. So does anybody disagree with the statement Hank just made? Kind of. Well, you're too far back. Okay. So so Nancy has an action to clarify this one statement. Do you now feel you have the answer to the questions on this slide?
Yes.
Yes. She has a but.
Yes, I do have a but. So my statement was, to me, this isn't clear. So my action is to update it, but I need volunteers to provide what that update should be, and then we can get into the discussion. Okay.
So let me, so I would like a show of hands of the 2 or 3 people that are willing to contribute text to Nancy to fix this. John? Dave? Hank? Perfect. You're willing to kibitz. Great. Thank you for the kibitzing, Jim.
All right. So I think we're good here. I had one more requirement, and we should probably just deal with that now while everyone's here. This one's much easier, I think.
Might have to defer something, but
yeah, that's fine. So yeah, basically this one is the requirement Jim mentioned, where the data model can be made up of it can be one giant monolithic data model or built of submodules. And really the main question here is it's kind of 2 different things, because at the second part of this requirement says the data model structure may reflect the structure of the information model. Based on feedback on the list when I brought this up, it seemed like there was some concern with that, and maybe we'd be better off changing it to a must, basically saying the data model must maintain the relationships in the information model. So what I was just thinking of proposing was maybe we could just split this up into 2 different requirements, and then also update it from may to must.
Jim Schott, my memory on this from arguing with Lisa at the time is that the structure referred to was not the elements and the relationships between the elements, but for example, whether one could break a subject up into multiple pieces, a subject in the IAM up into multiple pieces in the data model.
So instead of maybe having some type of hierarchy, you might just have like a flat.
Oh, you could have a flat, or what you could say is you could divide a person into 2 different things in the data model, rather than keeping the actual. A person is this set of properties. You still keep the relationship, but you don't have to keep that container that you had the relationship on.
Okay. I mean, the key part is we care about the relationships. Right? I don't care what it looks like, as long as you can.
You don't care about how the data is actually put together. That's what this was trying to say.
Okay. So I guess maybe when I read it, it wasn't clear to me that was the case. But
Dave Holtmeyer, can we live with the way it's currently written?
If that's what it means and everyone's okay with that, I'm fine. It was a question I had and I just wanted an answer.
So based on the information you've gotten, you don't need this change.
I don't. As long as it means we still have to maintain the relationships in the information model, I'm okay with it. We just need to make sure, that's clear with everyone else, because I think it was Ira said he was concerned with that particular statement.
Okay. Is that clear to people? Is it not clear to somebody? Okay. Let's move on.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, we'll just follow up on the list and say, reiterate what it's supposed to say, and hopefully we'll be good. All right. So basically, I guess out of this meeting, so we're going to work to kind of deal with those remaining issues on the IPFix syntax. And we're going to try to, I'd like to deal with those this week and have that kind of good to go. The next step, once we have that ready, is to take, so we have a bunch of information elements that were in the individual draft IM that Hank and Nancy put together, pull in those, but that requires converting them to the IPFix syntax. And we wanted to kind of wait to have that ironed out before we did that. So we'll take care of that. Looks like, there's some requirements, maybe like a minor update to the requirements on that first one there. So I'll gladly help, where I can. And then really the last two things for the IM is there's one section I didn't get to clean up, section 8. And so I have to do that. And then the biggest gap is kind of just better defining what the different types of guidance are, which is, will be important as, when we start getting into things like, collection guidance, evaluation guidance, which kind of, ties in with the oval data model work that we want to get started doing. So that's pretty much it there. Yep, we're good. That's it. All right, that's it. So yeah, so what do we have for time? Or is that all of it?
So what do you want to do?
So the next one is supposed to be the endpoint data.
Do we have time for
Endpoint
that?
data format.
And then we still have terminology. So I mean, you can.
Can we pick which one we think
do
is most?
terminology first or whatever?
Yeah, do terminology, because
Do terminology.
more important, I think.
Okay. Hank, I think we're going to swap the agenda and do the terminology next.
Which means get over here.
So hi, I'm Hank again, and I'm giving a quick highlights report on the current developments in the terminology draft, which is of course intended to align all the discussions we have here and define some results that can everybody use in the process of then finalizing drafts. First slide, please. What do I do? Yeah. First of all, I want to highlight that we started a collaboration with the I2NSF workgroup, which started a own terminology document, I think 2 IETFs ago. And we quickly found out that there is a significant overlap in definition of terms here. And in order not to shoot ourselves in the feet, we agreed to align these definitions. And where it was possible, we could build on each other's terms. So as a first step, John was so enthusiastic about this and included a lot of terms from SACM, basically adopted assertion, authentication, and authorization, which, while assertion is the only SACM original definition, and we already borrowed authentication, authorization from, I think, 4949. And build upon our definition of controller, control plane, and capability its own terms, which is very nice to have. It already shows that I2NSF can be I suppose, from an architectural point of view, be a provider and a consumer of information for SACM. And this is basically building this integration up, I think. So this is the way it looks today. And we built some very basic terminology which we use in the architecture now on the more general definitions of the I2NSF document, which is basically component, interface, role, and capability. All those are architectural terms. We are at the moment parked, but I took the liberty of explaining how the general terms of I2NSF are interoperable in alignment already with what we use now. There are new definitions according to this summary here in both terminology documents, and I would especially the workgroup of SACM, of course, ask to check out how interface, capability, and component now look like, and if it does feel correct. Because one specific issue I will raise today also on the next slide. So next slide. We now have a lot of ways how what a capability is, and I want to just state it is basically the potential function a second component can propagate into a domain that can be discovered. So if you need something done, if you need some provider of information, you can just discover a capability to provide that information in the second domain. It is as simple as that. And capability defined by the I2NSF says there's software that does something and provides something. So it's basically that, the architectural capability. And now with the upcoming vulnerability assessment scenario, we have new capabilities which do not really fit that profile at the moment. Especially talking about management, and to me, and that's a personal point of view, it implies that these capabilities decide something, coordinate something, but at least one of those, I think the vulnerability management capability is including only a data store capability or such. So I think we have to start to define what the actual information sets are that SACM wants to produce, so that they can be discovered as a capability, and I think we have to start to name those sets and start an enumeration here to get some, I think, some kind of content type that is interesting to SACM and that is provided actually, and that can be talked about and then mapped to the information model and such. And I think one way to move forward with that is talking about capabilities more and define that interface on protocol level, so people get a better understanding what this is actually about. I think the clarification and the result how to handle SWITs in the context of all the SACM data models is one way to go there. So this is basically coming from the point of view of the terminology and the confusion that somehow raises up again, maybe again and again. And I think we can finish that discussion and come to a solution here when we focus on a set of things that the interfaces want to talk about. Next slide, please. Similar but not the same problem now as the other component. We have a very good definition of a general component imported from I2NSF, which is again on the architectural side. We now have also components are on the data plane side, on the target endpoint of interest side, which is the software component and a hardware component, which is semantically different from the second component, of course, which is the architectural thingy. And component at the moment is only parent for second component, but not the other ones. This is bad somehow. I will raise the issue about this, and then we can define how a general component definition is done, because the one from I2NSF is basically, again, only about the architectural side of things. I think maybe John and I have to talk about this first, make a good issue out of this, and then can ask for input. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is again an ongoing task, is that we want to define what all these chains of components we can compose by the architecture actually conduct some tasks. For example, the PAT and C stuff is a solution for the task of collection. It is maybe not suitable for target endpoint discovery. So in order to find out which solutions already exists to present all these workflows, we define the tasks that then can be, again, combined to workflows. And we have already defined collection tasks. This is basically the earliest we did. And you have now characterization and classification, which are a bit long for a definition. They're very wordy. And I think this is an indication that this text should probably go into some other document, and we can really make it more concise, because basically we are explaining everything here, but the terminology is not supposed to explain how this all works. So this is an indication that characterization tasks and classification tasks as a bulk should go somewhere else. I'm not sure where. Maybe the architecture that is parked at the moment, I don't know. But it seems to me that because I was required to write so many texts, so many words about this, that there is missing text somewhere else. And we have still to flesh out or even design actually the definitions for authentication, registration and such. So like when a second component comes into a domain, is new, it wants to get some configuration, it requires some guidance, it wants to register somewhere. All this is not defined yet. We are missing, and that's maybe because we have no transport anymore. We have no way how to build the second domain, how to understand which component is online available, how to discover things. This is basically not covered yet. Adam raised a according email on the list and says, maybe we should tackle those things soon. And yeah, this is basically the most important missing piece. How does a second component register where exactly? And then how does discovery actually work? We don't have any operations and solutions for that anymore. And yeah, but again, this could also revolve again about, so I'm circling back about capabilities, because if we have those defined, we can understand how capabilities are registered and how they are discovered. And this is somehow related to that, I think. So getting a good set of capabilities might again actually be a good way forward, but this is again only my point of view, and this is only from the terminology, because it is difficult for John and me and for Jared and Nancy and so to make sense of all of that. This is somehow not fitting right. And I think that's because this is missing. We don't have that. That's a problem. So this is from the terminology point of view of report. And I hope that it was somehow not confusing. That's it. That's it. I guess. Oh, is another slide? No. Okay. Thank you. Are there questions? Maybe I would like to raise a question. Do you think that defining a set of capabilities, like I can provide SWIT tags in XML format, is something we should now start to enumerate in order to get something of working in progress list of these items, so we can better see what's still missing, what each use case wants? Is this a good way to move forward?
Dave Waltermeyer. I don't think so. I think we have a lot of work to do. We have some really basic engineering work that needs to be done here in SACM before we even have a full understanding of what the capabilities are. So I would suggest that we defer that work until we make progress on the current work that we're already doing.
If we finalize a draft, it is finalized. And if we realize, okay, we don't just want to have a unsolicited push of data, but also a query interface, but the solution does not provide it, and now it is mandatory somehow. Isn't that a problem?
So are we working towards final now? I mean,
yeah, maybe we are working to finalizing some documents here.
Okay.
So, and if we are not taking that into account, it might be, well, creating a schisma there with future documents.
So I guess the two observations I have are that I don't think the draft has to be final, and I don't think we need to know all the capabilities.
Yeah,
I think that for the subset of the things we're looking at now, we should be able to describe capabilities, because I think those are the things, especially when we start talking about ecosystem discovery, things like that, we'll need to be able to look up those capabilities, and those have to have very distinct meanings. We don't have to know them all, just the ones we need right now. So as we go along, we'll be discovering what those are, which might be the point you were making.
Yeah, but I just find I find it interesting that we're talking about discovering a capability that we haven't yet even worked out how it's going to work.
We're talking about how to discover it. That the list of items is not complete and will grow, I think I try to elaborate on.
So we don't even have a solution to discover yet.
Yeah.
So why are we talking about adding more capability into our solution set when we haven't even gotten that?
We're talking about getting SWIDs though, right? So if we talk about software identification, I'm capable of identifying or enumerating software on this thing. That's some form of capability, right? So we can start talking about that capability.
Well, but we have been. We've been
But
talking.
we haven't listed it as a capability. We haven't named it.
Right, but my point is I'm all for talking about individual capabilities. What I'm not for is defining a discovery mechanism for capabilities at this point in time.
I don't think I ever said exactly that, but yes, I understand what you're saying. We don't need to do the discovery mechanism right now. I would still like to enumerate or start enumerating the capabilities that we are working with.
Okay.
And I think this would help in the future to find a appropriate solution for this. We don't have to build a new protocol about this. Maybe we can just understand, if we know what we are talking about, we can select the appropriate solutions, I guess. Any other comments on this? Okay, thank you.
I just logistically, I mean, what's the timeline for this document?
For the terminology.
Yes.
You asked this again, and at first, if you want to have this finished, we will force other documents to adhere to that terminology that's in there. And I think this document is intended to finish when the core IDs are last call, and basically only in polish.
Okay.
This document is a good place to highlight inconsistencies and issues.
All right, so we want to be very clear that our plan is to keep this open. I
think so. You asked this the last time, I guess, and I was more in favor of maybe trying to stabilize terminology sooner than later. But I think there will be again inconsistencies, and if we finish it, that would be really a problem for us, I guess. Maybe, well, this is again only from my point of view.
Dan Romashkanu. So my recollection of the discussions that we had like 2 or 3 cycles back was that we said that we keep the terminology document open and we'll use it as a reference. Of course, having a stable reference is better than having an unstable one. But I don't remember whether we talked really about finalizing. If by finalizing you mean turning it into an RFC, I'm not sure. Maybe this will happen. This will happen not. But I think that was left like for a later decision.
I was just trying to get my head around what needs to be done when and in what time frame.
Stabilizing the content, I believe that's the focus.
This is of course important.
That's my opinion.
And then the terminology ID is not a showstopper. If this is still an ID, does not prevent any important work on solutions. It is only intended by being still open and editable, so to support work on the other documents and to make that more efficient. I think it is its purpose. So by saying this is not finalized, it is not a showstopper and it is not a missed target. I think it's actually a help.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So we're at 10 minutes to the end of the hour. We have one thing left on the agenda. And so what I was, and we have the time slot on Friday. I'm trying to remember where Danny is. I don't see him. I was looking at Charles instead. Well, I knew, I just wasn't seeing beyond you. Anyway, clearly I need a caffeine break. We were thinking of moving the final endpoint piece to Friday. Right. And I also didn't know if there was if there were specific pieces of work you all could work on, and it generally work during the week and then report out on Friday. So I'd kind of encourage whatever face-to-face collaboration you can get done this week.
Yeah.
Um,
I know there's some information model stuff.
oh yeah, sorry. Oh, that was bad on my part. Go to the microphone.
Yeah, on the information model, we'll be doing some work throughout the week, so we can try to give an update on that on Friday.
Okay. The one thing that I back on, since you're at the mic anyway, going back to the information model, there were the three IPv6 issue slides that you identified.
Yep.
I was wondering if you would mind sending, in my mind, somebody identifies an issue and there's a resolution to that issue.
Yep.
I'd like you to clarify on the mailing list what the resolution to each of those issues were.
Okay.
Or if you think they're not resolved yet, because I think we discussed each of them, but it wasn't clear to me that we identified what the resolution of it was.
Yeah, some of them we didn't get any feedback. So
Pardon?
We didn't get any comments on some of them, so. Yeah,
Well, then I think
put
then you,
something out on the list and see what we.
yeah, so then you propose a resolution and say,
Yeah.
right. It just occurred to me afterwards that normally you raise an issue and you walk away with some sort of resolution, or it's clear that there is no resolution. I'd just like to be clear.
Yep, that's fine.
And that way, if you propose that on the list in the next day or two, then there's time to revisit it on Friday and make sure that we do have
Okay. Yeah,
some
that works.
resolutions.
Yep. All right. Thanks.
All right. So we will meet again on Friday. Is there anything? 10 a.m. Yay. Is there anything else we want to do today, or do we want to take a quick? Go ahead, Dave.
Is this like open mic?
Yeah, this is open mic. Throw it open.
So I've talked to a few folks about this week, but I'd like to suggest that we stop doing the Friday meetings going forward for a couple of reasons. I think it's important for people that are participating in SACM to participate in other IETF working groups. And having the early week, late week meetings drives us to actually do a lot of work during the week on SACM, which distracts a lot from attending other working group meetings as part of the IETF. And for some of us that are actually very active in other groups, it's really hard to actually attend a lot of those side meetings throughout the week. So I'd like to suggest that maybe we stop doing the Friday meetings and maybe find another way to drive that kind of activity on the list, maybe between meetings.
Actually, it just so happens, Adam and I discussed this morning, and I don't think you're going to have to twist our arms too hard to move to one session a week. I think that the virtual interims are helping to drive more regular progress. And so I personally would also, chair hat off, would like to see us go to one session a week as well. I still think having like a 2-hour, 2.5-hour session would be helpful. But I don't think we necessarily need 2 sessions. I think we probably could have been a little bit better on time management and finished our session today. But since we have that time on Friday, I'd like to go ahead and use it. But I think unless is there anybody here who wants to meet twice a week? No? Excellent.
Thank you.
Anything else? You have 7 minutes left in your day. 7 extra minutes.
See you later. Thanks, everyone. Oh, hey, blue sheets. Can you guys?
Blue sheets.